By August 1945, the sun rose over Norfolk Harbor, casting long, shimmering reflections across the steel hulls of 23 battleships anchored in neat, solemn lines. Captain William "Bill" Harding stood at the edge of the pier, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his threadbare coat, staring at the looming silhouettes as though the ships themselves could answer the question gnawing at his mind. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The world exhaled. Yet here, in this misty morning light, victory felt strangely hollow. Bill had spent the better part of a decade aboard these floating fortresses, first as a junior officer, then as a commander of the USS Iowa's gunnery division. He knew the taste of powder and the roar of 16-inch guns. He had witnessed the firestorms over Okinawa and the desperate landings in the Philippines. And now, with the war behind them, the Navy faced a question he had never been trained to answer. What became of giants in a world that had suddenly outgrown them? The USS Missouri gleamed in the distance, its new paint still smelling of varnish and machine oil, a symbol of modernity and American industrial might. In contrast, the USS Arkansas, with its 1911 hull and weathered decks, groaned faintly under the tug of the tide, a relic that had survived 2 world wars, Pearl Harbor, and decades of storms. Between these extremes lay the other 21 ships, each with its scars, each with stories embedded in rivets and steel plates, and each now waiting in a limbo neither war nor peace could fill. Bill's thoughts drifted to the crewmen who had served on these ships. He remembered the letters he had read during the last months of fighting, letters from fathers writing to sons, sons writing to fathers, mothers writing to husbands lost to kamikaze strikes or hidden mines. The lives of so many intertwined with these vessels. Yet the Navy now contemplated sending some to the breakers, to be melted down for scrap, as if their very souls could be repurposed for civilian industry. A sudden wind brought the scent of salt and tar, mingling with the faint tang of gunpowder lingering in the air. Lieutenant Samora Fields, Bill's old friend from the South Dakota, approached, his face lined with the weariness of months at sea, yet bright with a grim determination. "You really think they'll keep the fast battleships?" she asked, her voice cutting through the mist. Samora had grown up in a family of naval engineers, and she carried with her the belief that steel, if properly maintained, could remain invincible. Bill shrugged. "I don't know. Missouri's new, Iowa and New Jersey are strong. But Congress doesn't care about history, Sam. They care about money. And I can't imagine the brass wants to pay for 33,000 tons of steel when a carrier can do more with half the crew." He sighed. The debate over relevance had been raging in offices filled with maps and budgets, while the sailors themselves had only whispered about it in mess halls and on watch. Now, it was no longer theory. It was a question of fate, of survival, not just for men, but for the vessels they loved. Bill walked along the pier toward the Missouri. Her decks stretched endlessly, gleaming in the early light, and he could almost hear the echoes of the Japanese surrender ceremony that had taken place just days ago in Tokyo Bay. Standing there, he imagined the cameras rolling, the ink still wet on official documents, and the solemn faces of dignitaries. The Missouri had already etched herself into history, yet even she would not escape scrutiny. The world had changed. Atomic bombs had fallen, guided missiles were emerging, and aircraft carriers had proven their supremacy. Could the battleship still dominate in a new era defined by planes and invisible weapons that traveled faster than any shell ever fired from her guns? The sound of boots on the gangway broke Bill's reverie. A young ensign, barely out of training, approached with a stack of reports and a nervous smile. "Captain Harding, the board requested your assessment on fleet retention and allocation." Bill took the papers with a heavy hand. He read over the reports. Costs, potential utility, anti-aircraft armaments, speed, armor thickness. He traced the lines with his finger, imagining crews, cannon smoke, the deafening roar of explosions. Some ships were worth keeping in active service or ready reserve. Others, the older ones, faced certain retirement, possibly scrapping, or, he shuddered, the atomic tests rumored to be planned at Bikini Atoll. "Mark my words," he said softly, more to himself than the ensign. "They'll take the oldest and turn them into targets. Science will study them while history forgets them." Zamora leaned against the railing, watching him. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Seeing the ships? Knowing what's coming?" Bill didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted toward the Arkansas again, imagining her steel hull shivering under the heat of an atomic explosion. He remembered Normandy, southern France, Okinawa. He remembered the cries of men and the smell of cordite and oil, and a sense of loss deeper than any battlefield wound filled him. "It does," he admitted finally, voice low. "It hurts to think that the men who bled for these decks won't be remembered. That the ships themselves, heroes of steel, could disappear because someone decided they were old." Above, gulls wheeled in the morning sky, their cries mingling with the gentle slap of water against steel. Bill looked out over the line of battleships and felt the enormity of the moment. This was more than demobilization. It was the end of an era. Decisions made in boardrooms under the weight of budgets and politics would shape history in ways few realized. And yet, somewhere in his chest, a spark of hope persisted. Some vessels, perhaps the fast battleships, would survive, preserved by necessity, by politics, or by history itself. Perhaps the guns would roar once more, not for global war, but for the defense of ideals too powerful to let fade quietly into the past. He folded the reports, tucked them under his arm, and turned back toward the pier, walking past the ships he had known for so long. The harbor was quiet now, but the tension of what was to come lingered, thick and unyielding, in the salt-tinged air. Victory had been won, yes, but the battleships, giants of steel, bearers of history, faced a future as uncertain as the tides. And Captain William Harding, like so many others, could only watch and wait, knowing that the choices made in these months would echo across decades, shaping the legacy of an entire fleet and the men who had sailed it. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Evie Carter stood on the quarterdeck of the USS Iowa, watching the morning fog lift over the harbor. Across the bay, the old battleships sat like ghosts from another age. The USS Arkansas, USS New York, and their sisters, their weathered steel hulls bearing the scars of 2 world wars. Evie had spent months aboard fast battleships during the final campaigns in the Pacific, and the contrast between the new and old vessels struck her with every glance. The Iowas and their North Carolina and South Dakota siblings gleamed with power and precision. Engines primed for speeds exceeding 32 knots, 16-inch guns polished to a mirror shine. Meanwhile, the older battleships, displacing barely a third more than 30,000 tons, seemed to sag under the weight of their history, slower, less armored, and carrying guns whose thunder had once commanded the seas but now felt faint against the roar of aircraft carriers and naval aviation. Evie walked the length of the deck, her boots clanging against the steel. She imagined what it must have been like for sailors decades earlier, trudging up the gangways of the Arkansas in 1915. Their hands blistered from coal, their eyes trained on the horizon, believing in the invincibility of armor and broadside firepower. Now, the Iowa class and its companions represented a new era of battleship design. Sleek hulls, massive firepower, and anti-aircraft batteries capable of fending off waves of kamikaze planes. Evie ran her fingers over the cold railing, thinking of the crews who had manned these modern leviathans. How they had defended carriers, escorted convoys, and unleashed thunderous shore bombardments from islands across the Pacific. She turned her gaze to the older vessels, docked in quiet ranks, hulls patched and repainted after Pearl Harbor and the island campaigns. These were the survivors of a bygone age, some rebuilt after catastrophic damage, others spared only by circumstance, their slower speeds making them unsuitable for the rapid maneuvers of modern task forces. Yet Evie knew better than to underestimate them. During amphibious landings, the older battleships had poured fire onto beaches with precision, their 12-inch and 14-inch guns hammering enemy fortifications and their crews enduring heat, smoke, and the deafening roar of artillery. They were relics, yes, but living proof that history's lessons still carried weight. As the sun climbed higher, the fog lifted completely, revealing the full scope of the fleet. 10 modern battleships, armored and fast, formed the vanguard of a navy now emerging victorious but uncertain about its future. The remaining 13 older vessels lingered like sentinels of memory, each a testament to an earlier philosophy of naval warfare. Evie's eyes lingered on the Missouri, newly commissioned and dazzling in its stature, and she thought of how quickly technology had transformed the art of war. Where the Arkansas and New Yorks had once dominated, aircraft carriers now cast shadows across the horizon. Missiles were whispered about in Navy offices, and atomic energy promised to render even the mightiest steel vulnerable. A voice called out from the deck below. Petty Officer James Malone waved, carrying reports detailing armor thickness, gun calibers, and anti-aircraft armament. Lieutenant, the board wants a comparative assessment of all active vessels. Speed, guns, crew requirements. They're deciding which ships stay in service. Evie took the papers, scanning the data with a trained eye. She noted the displacement differences, 31 to 35,000 tons for older ships versus 44 to 57,000 tons for the modern fast battleships. She studied the range and caliber of guns, the rate of fire, and the protective armor. It was a stark reminder. Evolution had not only created bigger and faster ships, but had fundamentally changed their roles. The fast battleships were built to guard carriers and deliver long-range fire, while the older vessels were relegated primarily to shore bombardment, their slower speeds leaving them vulnerable in a world now dominated by air power. Evie closed the folder, staring at the horizon where the sun glinted off the Missouri's turrets. "It's like looking at history and the future at the same time," she murmured. Malone nodded. "The old ships have served us well, but these new ones, they're the future. Fast, deadly, and built for the world we're entering." For a moment, the two stood in silence, the hum of the harbor punctuating their thoughts. Each vessel represented decades of design philosophy, lessons learned in war and peace, triumphs and failures encoded into steel and rivets. The old titans carried memory, the new behemoths carried promise. Yet both would soon face decisions beyond their control, dictated by budgets, politics, and the invisible hand of technological change. Evie felt a shiver run down her spine. She had seen the Navy at its peak, and now she saw it at a crossroads. In the span of a single war, the art of naval combat had transformed, and these ships, both old and new, were caught in the tide of history. She imagined the crews, past and present, climbing ladders, manning guns, navigating treacherous waters. Each ship held its stories, its triumphs, its scars. And as the fog dispersed completely, revealing the steel giants in full glory, Evie whispered to herself, "We may not know which will endure, but every one of you has earned your place in history." By December 1945, the harbor was quiet, but a sense of urgency lingered in the crisp winter air. Captain William Harding and Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Carter walked along the pier, the frosty mist curling around the massive steel hulls of the Navy's remaining battleships. They had spent the last 3 months poring over reports, attending briefings, and listening to endless debates about the fleet's future. Now, the moment of decision had arrived. The Navy was forced to draw lines of destiny, lines that would determine which ships remained in active service, which would be mothballed in reserve, and which would meet the scrapyard. The active fleet, as Harding explained to Evie, would be small but powerful. "The Iowa-class ships," he said, gesturing toward the gleaming turrets of USS Iowa, USS New Jersey, USS Missouri, and USS Wisconsin, "are our crown jewels, fast, heavily armed, and capable of keeping pace with carrier task forces. Scrapping them? Unthinkable." Evie nodded, tracing her gaze along the armored decks. "They're the future," she murmured, thinking of the speed, the firepower, and the versatility these ships possessed. If war comes again, these are the ships that will decide battles. Behind them, older battleships sat silently, shadows of a previous era. USS Arkansas, USS Nevada, and USS New York bore the marks of time and combat, their hulls pockmarked from Pearl Harbor and the island campaigns. Their speed was insufficient for modern operations, and their anti-aircraft batteries could barely contend with the threats now emerging in a nuclear and carrier-driven age. They were survivors, yet their survival was no longer enough to guarantee relevance. Cost, combat potential, and speed dictated their fate, and the brass in Washington had made it clear. Most of these old titans would not sail again. Evie held the report in her hands, running her finger down the lists of ships, noting the budgetary figures, maintenance costs, and combat effectiveness. "It's brutal," she said quietly. "These ships fought for everything we've achieved, and now their worth is measured in dollars and kilotons of steel." Harding's expression was grim. "It's not personal," he said. "It's strategy and economics. Keeping an old battleship active costs more than maintaining a dozen destroyers or submarines. The Navy has to think about tomorrow, not just yesterday." The reserve fleet represented a middle ground, holding vessels that were too valuable to scrap immediately but too expensive to maintain in full commission. Ships like the USS South Dakota, USS Massachusetts, USS Indiana, and USS Alabama were carefully preserved, dehumidified, and sealed against the elements, kept in conditions that theoretically allowed for reactivation if conflict returned. Evie walked past their decks, imagining the sailors who might one day return to man the guns, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down like the steel beneath her feet. Meanwhile, the oldest vessels faced a more final fate. USS Pennsylvania, USS New York, and USS Nevada were earmarked for disposal, but not simply for scrap. These ships would serve a final scientific purpose at Bikini Atoll, providing critical data on the effects of atomic weapons against capital ships. The thought was surreal. Ships that had survived the firestorms of the Pacific and the torpedoes of Pearl Harbor would now be exposed to a weapon of unimaginable power, their steel hulls a canvas for a new kind of warfare. Evie shivered at the thought, imagining the blast waves and the towering columns of water, and yet she understood. These ships would die with purpose, their destruction contributing to the Navy's understanding of the future of naval combat. As the sun rose higher, Harding and Evie stood side by side, watching sailors move about the piers, preparing the ships for their next phase. The air smelled of salt and coal smoke, mingled with oil and the faint tang of history. Harding's voice broke the silence. "December 1945, he said almost to himself. "The Navy draws its lines of destiny. Some will fight, some will wait, and some will face the scrapyard. History has chosen, and there's no turning back." Evie nodded, her eyes lingering on the Missouri, its turrets catching the light like a promise. "At least some will endure," she said softly, her hand brushing the cold steel railing. "And their stories will live." For the old battleships, their final chapter was beginning. For the fast ships, a future of readiness and potential awaited. And for the men and women who had sailed with them, the choices made in those winter months would echo through decades, shaping not just the Navy, but the very understanding of how war, technology, and history intersected. In the harbor, the steel giants remained silent, their fates decided but their spirits enduring. Victory had come, and with it, a responsibility to honor both the past and the future. As the mist lifted and sunlight glinted off the decks, it was clear that the Navy's legacy would be carried not just in memory, but in the cold, unyielding lines of steel and the decisions made in those uncertain months of 1945. By July 1946, the morning sun burned through a hazy veil over Bikini Atoll, turning the lagoon into a shimmering sheet of glass. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Carter stood aboard a small observation craft, notebook in hand, the sea stretching endlessly around her, dotted with steel leviathans that had once thundered across every ocean in the world. USS Arkansas, USS Nevada, and USS New York loomed like sleeping giants, each carrying decades of history in their armored hulls. They had survived torpedoes, bombs, and the chaos of World War II. But now they faced a weapon no sailor had ever imagined: the atomic bomb. Evie's heart tightened as she watched preparations unfold. The Able test and airburst detonation was scheduled above the assembled fleet. Scientists, engineers, and military planners hustled about, ropes and cables snaking over decks, instruments calibrated to measure the unimaginable. "It's unreal," whispered Petty Officer James Malone beside her. "These ships survived Pearl Harbor, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and now this." Evie nodded silently. She had seen the Navy at its most triumphant, and now she was about to witness its most terrifying trial. When the countdown began, silence fell over the lagoon. A blinding flash split the sky as the bomb detonated above the target ships. A mushroom cloud blossomed, and the force of the explosion rippled across the water with a shock that rattled even the stoutest hulls. Arkansas groaned under the invisible hammer of energy, steel plates buckling, decks twisting, but she remained afloat, listing and battered, a testament to her decades of construction and repair. Nevada, positioned closer to the point of detonation, absorbed the brunt of the blast yet stubbornly refused to sink. Her superstructure glowed in the infernal light before settling back into the calm of the sea, now radiated and tainted by the atomic fire. New York trembled, her hull shivering under the alien force, yet she too survived. Evie scribbled frantically in her notebook, documenting the damage, the lists, the scorched paint, and the eerie silence that followed. "We're watching history die and change at the same time," she murmured. Malone's eyes were wide, reflecting the mushroom cloud. This is the future of naval warfare. For the crews who had served aboard these vessels, for the sailors who had manned the guns under the Pacific sun, it was almost impossible to reconcile the power they had known with the power now unleashed. Just over 3 weeks later, on July 25th, the Baker test would push the experiment to its ultimate extreme, an underwater detonation. Evie and the team moved again to observation positions, this time closer to the lagoon's heart. As the bomb detonated beneath the waves, a titanic column of water erupted, towering into the sky like a liquid mountain. The base surge enveloped the fleet, swirling and crashing over decks, swallowing the Arkansas entirely. One moment the battleship had been a hulking sentinel. The next, she was gone, consumed by the unforgiving upheaval of nuclear energy. Nevada endured yet again. Though now her steel hull was twisted, her interior radioactive, her fate sealed as unsalvageable. New York suffered similarly, her strength diminished, reduced to a silent witness to the dawn of a new era. Standing on a nearby boat, Evie felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the tropical sun. These ships, once the pride of a global navy, were casualties of progress. No torpedo, no dive bomber, no artillery had ever wrought such indiscriminate destruction. She realized then that naval strategy, naval engineering, and the very idea of a battleship's invincibility had been irrevocably altered. The nuclear age had arrived, and with it, a new hierarchy of power where steel alone could not protect men, and speed alone could not outpace destiny. That evening, as the wind died down and the waters of Bikini returned to an uneasy calm, Evie walked among the survivors' skeletons. Twisted metal and scorched paint marked where heroes had once walked, where thousands of shells had roared, and now lay waiting for the next chapter in history. The sight was both humbling and haunting. Arkansas was gone, swallowed by water and fire. Nevada, though afloat, was a radioactive ghost. New York's battered form bore silent testimony to the transition from conventional to nuclear warfare. Evie realized, as she penned her final notes, that these tests were more than scientific experiments. They were a brutal message to the world and a solemn epitaph for an era of naval dominance. The proud battleships had faced a weapon unimaginable, and while some survived, none remained unchanged. The atomic bomb had demonstrated that even the greatest steel giants were vulnerable, marking the beginning of a naval paradigm shift where carriers, missiles, and nuclear strategy would dominate, and the battleship, once the unquestioned sovereign of the seas, was forced to reckon with obsolescence. Between 1946 to 1965, the piers of Norfolk and Philadelphia hummed with the muted sounds of hammers, cranes, and diesel engines as the Navy moved decisively to reshape its post-war fleet. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Carter watched from the deck of a small observation launch as crews dismantled USS Idaho, sending sheets of steel into waiting barges that would carry her remnants to the breakers. The air smelled of burning metal and salt, a bitter perfume of progress over sentiment. Ships that had fought across the Pacific, Idaho, Mississippi, New Mexico, Tennessee, and California were no longer symbols of might. To Congress and the Navy, they had become costly relics, their maintenance bills outweighing any practical value. For the men who had sailed on them, It felt like watching friends disappear, one hammer blow at a time. Yet amid the scrapping and the sadness, there were stories of resistance, of hope, of the stubborn human impulse to preserve history. Citizens, veterans, and state governments rallied to save ships from the scrapyard. Alabama, her hull still gleaming from wartime campaigns, became the focus of a determined preservation campaign led by the state of Alabama. Volunteers raised funds, lobbied officials, and organized committees, insisting that their battleship, a veteran of the Atlantic and Pacific, deserved a second life as a monument to courage, sacrifice, and national pride. Massachusetts followed suit in New England, stricken from the Navy list in 1962 but rescued by a coalition of historians, civic leaders, and sailors who remembered the roar of her 16-inch guns and the thunder of her decks. North Carolina, too, found sanctuary, preserved at Wilmington to remind future generations of her place in naval history. Evie walked along the decks of Alabama during one of her inspections, imagining the sailors who had trained, fought, and survived on her steel bones. "It's strange," she said to Petty Officer Malone, "to think some of these ships are being scrapped for money, and others are saved because people won't let them die." Malone nodded, tracing a finger along the edge of a turret. "Sentiment is powerful," he replied. "History isn't just in the books. It's in these decks, these guns, these hulls. People know it." For the Navy, the decisions were pragmatic. Maintaining the reserve fleet of fast battleships, the Iowa-class ships, along with newer North Carolina and South Dakota vessels, required careful budgeting, preservation techniques, and foresight. Decks were coated in heavy grease to prevent rust, machinery spaces dehumidified, and hatches sealed against the elements, all to keep them ready for an uncertain future. The contrast was stark. Some ships vanished beneath the torches of scrappers, their metal recycled for peacetime industry, while others were carefully preserved as monuments, living museums to a time when battleships ruled the waves. Each decision reflected not only the Navy's strategic calculations, but also the power of public sentiment, civic pride, and historical consciousness. Evie often thought of how the older ships, once the pride of the fleet, had been doomed to scrap until communities and veterans intervened, elevating them from mere steel to symbols of memory and identity. By the mid-1960s, the fruits of these efforts were evident. USS Alabama arrived at her permanent berth in Mobile Bay in 1964, opening to the public the following January. Massachusetts was unveiled at Fall River in 1965, and North Carolina welcomed visitors in Wilmington in 1961. Their preservation transformed them from tools of war into vessels of education, connecting thousands of visitors each year with the history, scale, and complexity of naval operations during the Second World War. Meanwhile, the Navy's fast battleships, maintained in reserve, quietly awaited their fate, ready to respond if the world demanded, yet also preserved as potential museum ships, a bridge between military necessity and historical legacy. Evie often reflected on the irony. Ships that had thundered across oceans, sunk enemies, and survived atomic blasts now owed their survival not to speed, firepower, or armor, but to human will, the voices of citizens, veterans, and historians determined to keep memory alive. She ran her hands along Alabama's cold steel, feeling the weight of decades and battles, and knew that history was as much about the people who remembered as the ships themselves. Money had dictated destruction, but sentiment had dictated survival. And in that delicate balance, the story of America's battleships was preserved for generations yet to come. By the time September 1950 came, the gray waters off the coast of Korea were restless, churned by both tide and tension. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Carter stood on the deck of USS Missouri, her boots heavy against the steel plating, binoculars pressed to her eyes. Smoke and dust rose from the hillsides of Incheon, where United Nations forces fought desperately to reclaim territory from North Korean and Chinese troops. Jets screamed overhead, missiles streaked across the horizon, but it was the battleships, slow, lumbering, yet terrifyingly powerful, that were about to remind the world that steel and firepower still mattered. Missouri's 16-inch guns roared, spitting shells over 20 kilometers inland. each weighing over a ton, each carrying the weight of history and the hopes of soldiers on the front lines. Evie scribbled notes in her weathered notebook, recording trajectories, timing, and impact. The ground shook with every salvo, sending echoes into the hills and valleys, shaking both enemy positions and the nerves of those watching from the deck. USS New Jersey joined the bombardment, her massive turrets trained with mechanical precision, while USS Iowa and USS Wisconsin soon followed, forming a deadly quartet that brought the Navy's past power into a modern battlefield. Evie remembered the debates in Washington, the discussions of obsolescence, and the lingering doubts about whether these relics of World War II still had a place in a new age of jet aircraft and guided missiles. But here, amid the rugged Korean coastline, there was no doubt. The 16-inch guns were instruments of precision and devastation, capable of leveling bunkers, fortifications, and troop concentrations that smaller artillery could never reach. Soldiers in the field sent back messages of gratitude, calling the battleships the steel hammers of Korea. And for Evie, the nickname felt entirely earned. Wisconsin held a somber distinction. On March 25, 1953, she fired the last 16-inch shells in combat, a series of final salvos that would mark the end of an era. Evie stood at the observation post, watching the massive projectiles arc toward distant hills, glowing faintly in the sun's reflection on the powder smoke. There was a poetry to it, a culmination of decades of naval tradition, the thunder of history echoing one last time in anger before the guns fell silent. Throughout the conflict, the reactivated battleships proved invaluable, not just for firepower but for the morale they inspired. Sailors who had served in World War II found themselves once again aboard these familiar steel giants, reliving both memories and nightmares. For new recruits, the scale and raw force of the Iowa-class ships were awe-inspiring, an almost mythic presence amidst the modern chaos of war. The 4 ships fired thousands of shells during the Korean War, each round a testament to the enduring potency of well-designed, heavily armed capital ships, even in a world increasingly dominated by air power. Yet beneath the thunder and glory, Evie sensed the shifting tides of naval warfare. The battleship's guns, though formidable, were no longer the decisive instruments they had once been. Missiles, aircraft, and new technology were shaping the future, and the Navy knew that the Iowa-class's return to combat was a temporary reprieve, a reminder of past dominance rather than a blueprint for future strategy. Still, for those months in Korean waters, these aging giants proved that steel, training, and firepower could still change the course of battles and protect soldiers on distant shores. As the armistice loomed in July 1953, the battleships began to withdraw, their decks silent for the first time in years. Evie walked along Missouri's Teak, watching the last clouds of smoke drift from the exhausted barrels of her guns. She traced the marks of history etched into the steel, reflecting on the contrast between past wars and this modern conflict. The roar of the 16-inch guns had been decisive, terrifying, and awe-inspiring, but it was also the swan song of an age. Soon, the ships would return to reserve fleets, their power stored, their relevance questioned, waiting for another moment when history might call upon them once more. From 1968 to 1989, the humid air off the coast of Vietnam carried the distant echo of helicopter rotors and the faint smell of napalm drifting inland. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Carter, now a veteran observer of decades of naval evolution, stood on the deck of USS New Jersey as her massive hull cut through the Gulf waters. The ship had been recommissioned specifically for this conflict, her 16-inch guns polished and ready to remind the world that, even in the age of missiles and jets, steel and firepower still mattered. The sailors moved with practiced precision, loading shells that weighed over a ton each, the deck vibrating with the anticipation of unleashed force. As New Jersey's guns thundered against enemy positions along the Vietnamese coastline, the ground shook, and enemy bunkers crumbled under the relentless barrage. Marines and soldiers inland looked to the horizon for the telltale flashes, knowing that with each salvo, they gained crucial minutes, vital cover, and a fighting chance to hold their positions. Evie noted the coordination required. The blend of naval gunnery, aerial spotting, and ground intelligence was delicate, intricate, and deadly effective. The battleship, in its twilight years, had carved out a niche that no missile or aircraft could entirely replace. Sustained, accurate, and devastating coastal bombardment. By March 1969, after months of fire support missions, New Jersey returned to the United States, her decks still humming with the ghosts of past battles, the echo of gunfire across oceans and continents. For Evie, it was a bittersweet reminder that while the age of the battleship was ending, its legacy and its impact in Vietnam was undeniable. The docks of Norfolk were alive with transformation. The 4 Iowa-class battleships, relics of the Second World War, were about to become icons of a new naval era. Under President Reagan's 600-ship Navy program, modernization programs infused these vessels with 21st-century technology. Evie walked along USS New Jersey's deck as engineers removed obsolete anti-aircraft guns, replaced them with phalanx CIWS systems, and installed armored launchers capable of firing Tomahawk cruise missiles over 1,000 miles. Harpoon anti-ship missiles glinted in their racks, ready for modern surface combat. Electronics, radars, and communication systems had been upgraded, creating a fusion of old steel and cutting-edge warfare technology. The ships soon returned to combat deployments. New Jersey shelled targets in Lebanon, while Iowa patrolled the Atlantic and Caribbean. The roar of 16-inch guns mingled with the whine of missiles, a dual legacy of historical artillery and modern precision strike. But the revival was not without tragedy. On April 19, 1989, a turret explosion aboard Iowa claimed 47 lives, a stark reminder of the dangers inherent in operating ships built decades earlier even with modern systems. The Persian Gulf War of 1991 would serve as the ultimate demonstration. Missouri and Wisconsin launched Tomahawk missiles against Iraqi targets, while also providing traditional gunfire support along the coastline. Missouri fired 28 Tomahawks on the first night of Operation Desert Storm. Wisconsin added 24 more during the conflict. Even as missiles dominated, the 16-inch guns remained a powerful symbol of America's naval heritage, bridging the past and present in a way no other vessel could. The 1980s modernization illustrated both ingenuity and practicality. Historic battleships could be refitted to serve in a modern combat environment, demonstrating their lasting tactical relevance. Yet it also underscored the limits of preservation. Maintenance costs were high, and even modernized steel giants were vulnerable to accidents and evolving threats. For Evie, observing the Iowa class in this new role was profoundly moving, a testament to adaptability, resilience, and the enduring spirit of naval engineering. From 1990 to 2006, the waters of the Persian Gulf shimmered under the winter sun, but beneath the surface lay tension and danger. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Carter, now a seasoned observer of half a century of naval history, watched as USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin cut through the waves, their decks alive with activity. The Persian Gulf War was underway, and these steel giants, born in the fires of World War II, were called once more to serve. Missouri's Tomahawk cruise missiles streaked silently across the sky, 28 precise strikes on Iraqi command centers and military targets during the opening hours of Operation Desert Storm. Wisconsin followed, firing 24 missiles at strategic positions, each launch a demonstration of how historic vessels could integrate modern warfare technology. Yet even as missiles flew with deadly accuracy, the old guns of the Iowa class remained ready, a tangible link to past conflicts. Along the coast, the 16-inch guns roared, delivering artillery fire to support coalition ground forces and shaping battles from afar. But the Persian Gulf also revealed the vulnerabilities of these massive ships. On February 6th, an Iraqi Silkworm anti-ship missile targeted Missouri. Though it was intercepted by defensive systems from accompanying vessels, the threat underscored that even these legendary battleships were no longer invincible. Evie reflected on the irony. The weapons that had once dominated the seas were now complemented, and sometimes surpassed, by technology their designers could scarcely have imagined. Despite the limitations, the Iowa-class battleship service in Desert Storm highlighted both their enduring capabilities and the realities of modern naval warfare. Precision missiles could replicate some functions, but the sheer psychological and tactical weight of a battleship's presence, the thunder of 16-inch shells, and the visible might of steel hulls brought a unique effect to the battlefield. Yet with this conflict, it became clear that their era was ending. Maintenance costs were astronomical, spare parts scarce, and the Navy faced pressure to fund newer, more flexible platforms. By September 1991, Missouri, Wisconsin, Iowa, and New Jersey would enter their final retirements, returning to reserve status, their combat days complete. The story of America's battleships did not end with combat. Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin were preserved as monuments, joining Alabama, Massachusetts, and North Carolina in telling the broader narrative of U.S. naval power. Each vessel became a museum, a floating classroom for generations to walk teak decks, peer into massive gun turrets, and explore the labyrinthine interiors that once housed sailors, officers, and the machinery of war. Visitors could feel the weight of history under their feet, trace the evolution of naval design, and witness firsthand the scale of engineering that had shaped the outcome of wars. For Evie, walking aboard these ships decades after their guns had fallen silent was both humbling and inspiring. Battleships had been more than weapons. They were symbols of national power, courage, and technological achievement. From the Pearl Harbor survivors to the Iowa-class giants firing missiles in Desert Storm, each ship told a story of strategic evolution, of the tension between cost and utility, and of the powerful role public sentiment played in preserving history. Without the voices of veterans, historians, and citizens who insisted on saving representative vessels, the tangible connection to naval heritage might have been lost. By 2006, all 4 Iowa-class battleships were officially stricken from the Naval Register, yet their survival as museums represented an unprecedented success in preservation. Alabama, Massachusetts, and North Carolina similarly offered enduring lessons. The ships had transitioned from instruments of war to guardians of memory, educating millions and allowing people to experience history in ways photographs or documents could never capture. They stood as reminders that technology evolves, warfare changes, and empires rise and fall. But human curiosity and respect for history can ensure that the stories of steel giants remain alive. From Pearl Harbor to the Persian Gulf, from atomic test targets to museum decks, the saga of America's battleship spans nearly a century. They were tools of conflict, symbols of innovation, and now, enduring beacons of education and remembrance. The roar of their guns may be silent, but their legacy resonates across oceans, through classrooms, and in the hearts of those who understand the power and sacrifice embodied in every hull, turret, and deck.